He'd simply retired to their corners to pant and sprawl, trying to recover, while new contestants took the ring for the next bout of the evening. Dan mounted the steps slowly, pacing himself. He was still exhausted from 5 years of nearly continuous sea duty, first as commanding officer of USS Savo Island, then directing larger task forces as America rebuilt its fleet and smashed a Chinese submarine offensive, and at last pushed forward again, island hopping across the Pacific and China seas until the final campaigns in North Korea, Taiwan, Hainan, and Hong Kong. He was fighting radiation exposure, too, from a cross-country hunt for his daughter. Thank God she'd surfaced again. Ill, nearly starved, but still among the living. Though 10 million other Americans weren't. He flourished his ID one last time at the Marines who flanked the massive doors, then trudged in. The familiar corridors weren't exactly deserted, but they lacked the bustle he remembered from when he'd worked for the Joint Chiefs. He ambled up a ramp. Once these tiled decks had been lovingly waxed to a gleaming sheen. Now they were dirty and scuffed. Half the overhead lamps were burned out, and shadows gloomed the narrow side corridors. "Admiral," said Donnie Wank as Dan let himself into his closet of an office. The Master Chief stood by the coffee urn, holding a tablet computer. They'd been together since before the war. Wank's blonde hair was graying now, like Dan's, but his fierce blue eyes were as mad-looking as ever. "You're looking better, I think." Dan nodded. "The docs say the white count's trending up. And it's captain again now, Master Chief, not admiral." Wank shrugged. "Whatever. That's good, right? New treatment's working?" "Seems to be. What have we got today?" Dan didn't expect much. He was on temporary limited duty with the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations, assigned to help write a study on post-war force structure. The Joint Staff and Army Futures Command were planning war games to revise contingency plans and redesign the force. Regenerate the infrastructure was the buzz phrase. His staff consisted of Wank and 2 junior enlisted, but most of the actual research was being done by a think tank. Also, as a self-assigned task, he'd advocated for the establishment of a small covert unit tasked to defuse emergent naval threats. Rather like the old Tactical Analysis Group on which he'd served before the war. It was being stood up on the West Coast. Wank held up his tablet. "Just came in. You're needed on the E-ring." Dan examined the message. "The CNO. Maybe Nick's got something for you." "Maybe. And you mean Admiral Niles, not Nick," he muttered. Dan doubted there'd be anything important. He'd put in for his twilight tour, a favor retiring officers and senior enlisted were sometimes granted, but doubted he'd get it. With the signing of the Singapore Treaty, senior officers were in excess. The services were shedding anyone they didn't need to fight the rebellions, which meant next year's budget would prioritize the Army, Guard, and the new Homeland Security battalions. He'd probably end his career here in the Puzzle Palace, with a sheet cake from the cafeteria and a lunch-hour party before turning in his badge and walking out the door to retirement. He read the rest of the email. 0800. He'd barely make it. Wank handed him a paper cup, so hot it scorched his fingers. He passed it from hand to hand and headed on out. Dan had first worked for Niles at the Cruise Missiles Project office in Crystal City. He'd disappointed his senior then, but as Niles had risen, he'd given Dan another chance. Shuttled him to a stash billet after the assassination attempt in the West Wing. After becoming CNO a year into the war, Dan's reluctant rabbi had tasked him with Operation Recoil, a spoiling attack on North China. Hardly anyone had expected his force to survive. But against all expectations, Dan had managed to...